In the terms of grand strategy, it was probably a mistake. It is sometimes hard to know what the long-term effects of achieving a goal will be, but the more seriously and realistically you examine the possibilities downwind, the less likely you are to miscalculate. Widen your perspective. Grand strategy is a function of vision, of seeing further in time and space than the enemy does. The process of foresight is unnatural. We can only ever live in the present, which is the ground for our consciousness, and our subjective experiences and desires narrow the scope of our vision. They are like a prison we inhabit. Your task as a grand strategist is to force yourself to widen your view, to take in more of the world around you, to see things for what they are and for how they may play out in the future, not for how you wish them to be. Every event has a reason, a causal chain of relationships that made it happen. You have to dig deep into that reality instead of seeing only the surfaces of things. The closer you get to objectivity, the better your strategies and the easier the path to your goals. You can take a step in this direction by always trying to look at the world through the eyes of other people, including most definitely your enemy, before engaging in war. Your own cultural preconceptions are a major hindrance to seeing the world objectively. Looking through other people's eyes is not a question of political correctness or of some soft, hazy sensitivity. It makes your strategies more effective. During the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese intensely studied the American cultural scene. They looked for shifts in public opinion and strained to understand the U.S. political system and the social effects of television. American strategists, on the other hand, revealed an absolutely minimal understanding of the alien cultures of Vietnam, whether the South Vietnamese culture they were supporting or the North Vietnamese culture they were trying to fight. Blinded by their obsession with stopping the spread of communism, they failed to note the far deeper influences of culture and religion on the North Vietnamese way of fighting. Theirs was a grand strategic blunder of the highest order. Grand strategists keep sensitive antennae attuned to the politics of any situation. Politics is the art of promoting and protecting your own interests. You might think it was largely a question of parties and factions, but every individual is, among other things, a political creature seeking to secure his or her own position. Your behavior in the world always has political consequences in that the people around you will analyze it in terms of whether it helps or harms them. To win the battle at the cost of alienating potential allies or creating intractable enemies is never wise. Taking politics into account, you must figure out your grand strategy with a mind to gaining support from other people, to creating and strengthening a base. In the Roman Civil War in 49 BC, Julius Caesar faced off against Pompey, who was then the more experienced military man. Caesar gained the edge by planning his maneuvers with an eye to their effect on public opinion in Rome. Lacking support in the Senate, he built support among the general public. Caesar was a brilliant political animal, and what made him so was his grasp of the public psyche. He understood their self-interest and shaped his strategies accordingly. Being political means understanding people, seeing through their eyes. Sever the roots. In a society dominated by appearances, the real source of a problem is sometimes hard to grasp. To work out a grand strategy against an enemy, you have to know what motivates him, or is the source of his power. Too many wars and battles drag on because neither side knows how to strike at the other's roots. As a grand strategist, you must expand your vision not only far and wide, but under. Think hard, dig deep. Do not take appearances for reality. Uncover the roots of the trouble, and you can strategize to sever them, ending the war or problem with finality. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded Italy in 218 BC, various Roman generals strained to defeat him, but none was effective. The Roman general, later called Scipio Africanus, looked at the situation differently. The problem wasn't Hannibal himself, or his base in Spain, or his ability to restock his supplies by sea from Carthage. The problem was Carthage itself. This was a country with an intractable hatred of Rome, and a long power struggle had endured between the two. Instead of taking on Hannibal, a brilliant military man in Italy then, Scipio invaded Carthage, forcing Hannibal to leave Italy to defend his homeland. The attack on Carthage was more than a mere feint to draw Hannibal away. It was a sizable invasion. Scipio's grand strategy worked to perfection. Not only did he defeat Hannibal in battle, he destroyed Carthage as a rival power, permanently ending its ability to stand up to Rome. A part of grand strategy related to severing the roots is seeing dangers as they start to sprout, then cutting them down before they get too big to handle. A grand strategist knows the value of preemptive action. Take the indirect route to your goal. The greatest danger you face in strategy is losing the initiative and finding yourself constantly reacting to what the other side does. The solution, of course, is to plan ahead, but also to plan subtly, to take the indirect route. Preventing your opponent from seeing the purpose of your actions gives you an enormous advantage. So make your first move merely a setup, designed to extract a response from your opponent that opens him up to what comes next. Hit him directly, and he reacts, taking a defensive pose that may allow him to parry your next blow. But if he can't see the point of your strike, or if it misleads him as to where the next one will come from, he is defenseless and blind. The key is to maintain control of your emotions and plot your moves in advance, seeing the entire chessboard. The film director Alfred Hitchcock made this strategy a life principle. His every action a setup designed to yield results down the road, he calmly thought ahead and moved step by step. His goal was to make a film that matched his original vision, uncorrupted by the influence of the actors, producers, and other staff who necessarily came along later. By controlling every detail of the film's screenplay, he made it almost impossible for the producer to interfere. Should the producer try to meddle during the actual shooting, Hitchcock would have a camera ready on set with no film in it. He could pretend to take the extra shots that the producer wanted, letting the producer feel powerful without risk to the end result. Hitchcock did the same with actors. Instead of telling them directly what to do, he would infect them with the emotion he wanted, fear, anger, desire, by the way he treated them on set. Every step on the campaign trail fit perfectly into the next one. In working on the level not of the battle but of the campaign, your first step is crucial. It should usually be deceptively soft and indirect, making it harder to read. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor during World War II was a devastating surprise, but as the first move of a campaign, it was a disaster. The Japanese showed their hand too quickly, rallying American public opinion to an intense level of anger. They ensured that the Americans would prosecute the war to the bitter end. And it was the Americans who had the greater military resources. Always pay attention to the first step of the campaign. It sets the tempo, determines the enemy's mindset, and launches you in a direction that had better be the right one. The Prussian military theoretician Karl von Clausewitz famously argued that war is the continuation of politics by other means. He meant that every nation has goals, security, well-being, prosperity, that it ordinarily pursues through politics. But when another nation or internal force thwarts their achievement through politics, war is the natural result. War is never merely about victory on the battlefield or the simple conquest of land. It is about the pursuit of a policy that cannot be realized in any other way than through force. When a war is lost, however, all fingers usually point at the military. We may sometimes go over the generals' heads to the politicians who declared war in the first place. During and after the Vietnam War, for example, some blamed the loss on the government's failure to commit to the war with full effort. More often, though, the post-game analysis is military. We pore over the war's battles, critiquing the officers' moves. And of course, it is the military that has planned and fought the war, but even so, the real problem is a problem of grand strategy. According to von Clausewitz, failure in war is a failure of policy. The goals of the war and the policies that drove it were unrealistic, inappropriate, blind to other factors. This idea is the philosophy of the grand strategist. Whenever anything goes wrong, it is human nature to blame this person or that. Let other people engage in such stupidity, led around by their noses, seeing only what is immediately visible to the eye. You see things differently. When an action goes wrong, in business, in politics, in life, trace it back to the policy that inspired it in the first place. The goal was misguided. This means that you yourself are largely the agent of anything bad that happens to you. With more prudence, wiser policies, and greater vision, you could have avoided the danger. So when something goes wrong, look deep into yourself, not in an emotional way to blame yourself or indulge your feelings of guilt, but to make sure that you start your next campaign with a firmer step and greater vision. Reversal. Grand strategy involves two dangers that you must consider and combat. First, the successes it brings you in your first campaigns may have the same effect on you that easy victory on the battlefield gives a general. Drunk on triumph, you may lose the sense of realism and proportion on which your future moves depend. Even such supreme grand strategists as Julius Caesar and Napoleon eventually fell victim to this dynamic. Losing their sense of reality, they began to believe that their instincts were infallible. The greater the victory, the greater the danger. As you get older, as you move to your next campaign, you must retrench, strain doubly hard to rein in your emotions, and maintain a sense of realism. Second, the detachment necessary to grand strategy can bring you to a point where you find it hard to act. Understanding the world too well, you have seen too many options and become as indecisive as Hamlet. No matter how far we progress, we remain part animal, and it is the animal in us that fires our strategies, gives them life, animates us to fight. Without the desire to fight, without a capacity for the violence war churns up, we cannot deal with danger. The prudent Odysseus types are comfortable with both sides of their nature. They plan ahead as best they can, see far and wide, but when it comes time to move ahead, they move. Knowing how to control your emotions means not repressing them completely, but using them to their best effect. Here are further reflections on the grand strategy. From the I Ching. Readiness is everything. Resolution is indissolubly bound up with caution. If an individual is careful and keeps his wits about him, he need not become excited or alarmed. If he is watchful at all times, even before danger is present, he is armed when danger approaches and need not be afraid. The superior man is on his guard against what is not yet in sight and on the alert for what is not yet within hearing. Therefore, he dwells in the midst of difficulties as though they did not exist. If reason triumphs, the passions withdraw of themselves. From Aesop's Fables. The fox and the monkey elected king. The monkey, having danced in an assembly of the animals and earned their approval, was elected by them to be king. The fox was jealous. So, seeing a piece of meat one day in a snare, he led the monkey to it, saying that he had found a treasure. But rather than take it for himself, he had kept guard over it, as its possession was surely a prerogative of royalty. The fox then urged him to take it. The monkey approached it, taking no care, and was caught in the trap. When he accused the fox of luring him into a trap, the fox replied, "Monkey, you want to reign over all the animals, but look what a fool you are." It is thus that those who throw themselves into an enterprise without sufficient thought not only fail, but even become a laughingstock. From Selected Military Writings by Mao Zedong. Epistemologically speaking, the source of all erroneous views on war lies in idealist and mechanistic tendencies. People with such tendencies are subjective and one-sided in their approach to problems. They indulge in groundless and purely subjective talk, basing themselves upon a single aspect or temporary manifestation, and magnify it with similar subjectivity into the whole of the problem. Only by opposing idealistic and mechanistic tendencies and taking an objective, all-sided view in making a study of war can we draw correct conclusions on the question of war. From The Strategic Advantage, Sun Tzu and Western Approaches to War. There is, however, much difference between the East and the West in cultural heritages, in values, and in ways of thinking. In the Eastern way of thinking, one starts with the whole, takes everything as a whole, and proceeds with a comprehensive and intuitive synthesization, combination. In the Western way of thinking, however, one starts with the parts, takes, divides a complex matter into component parts, and then deals with them one by one, with an emphasis on logical analysis. Accordingly, Western traditional military thought advocates a direct military approach with a stress on the use of armed forces. From the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna's Counsel in Time of War. When dark inertia increases, obscurity and inactivity, negligence and delusion arise. When lucidity prevails, the self whose body dies enters the untainted worlds of those who know reality. When he dies in passion, he is born among lovers of action. So when he dies in dark inertia, he is born into wombs of folly. The fruit of good conduct is pure and untainted, they say, but suffering is the fruit of passion, ignorance the fruit of dark inertia. From lucidity, knowledge is born. From passion comes greed. From dark inertia come negligence, delusion, and ignorance. Men who are lucid go upward. Men of passion stay in between. Men of dark inertia, caught in vile ways, sink low. From The Odyssey by Homer. At this, the gray-eyed goddess Athena smiled and gave him a caress, her looks being changed now, so she seemed a woman, tall and beautiful, and no doubt skilled at weaving splendid things. She answered briskly, "Whoever gets around you, Odysseus, must be sharp and guileful as a snake. Even a god might bow to you in ways of dissimulation. You chameleon, bottomless bag of tricks. Here in your own country, would you not give your stratagems a rest or stop spellbinding for an instant? Two of a kind we are, contrivers both. Of all men now alive, you are the best in plots and storytelling. My own fame is for wisdom among the gods. Deceptions, too." From the Iliad by Homer. Then he saw Odysseus and asked, "Now tell me about this one, dear child. Shorter than Agamemnon by a head, but broader in the shoulders and chest. His armor is lying on the ground, and he's roaming the ranks like a ram. That's it, just like a thick-fleeced ram striding through a flock of silvery sheep. And Helen, Zeus's child. That is Laertes' son, the master strategist Odysseus, born and bred in the rocky hills of Ithaca. He knows every trick there is, and his mind runs deep. Antenor turned to her and observed astutely, "Your words are not off the mark there, madam. Odysseus came here once before, on an embassy for your sake, along with Menelaus. I entertained them courteously in the great hall, and learned each man's character and depth of mind. Standing in a crowd of Trojans, Menelaus, with his wide shoulders, was more prominent. But when both were seated, Odysseus was lordlier. When it came time for each to speak in public and weave a spell of wisdom with their words, Menelaus spoke fluently enough, to the point, and very clearly, but briefly, since he is not a man of many words. Being older, he spoke first. Then Odysseus, the master strategist, rose quickly, but just stood there, his eyes fixed on the ground. He did not move his staff forward or backward, but held it steady. You would have thought him a dull, surly lout without any wit. But when he opened his mouth and projected his voice, the words fell down like snowflakes in a blizzard. No mortal could have vied with Odysseus then, and we no longer held his looks against him. By Friedrich Nietzsche. Forgetting our objectives. During the journey, we commonly forget its goal. Almost every profession is chosen and commenced as a means to an end, but continued as an end in itself. Forgetting our objectives is the most frequent of all acts of stupidity. From Tao Te Ching, by Lao Tzu. Plot against the difficult while it remains easy. Act against the great while it is still minute. Difficult affairs throughout the realm invariably commence with the easy. Great affairs throughout the realm inevitably commence with the small. For this reason, the sage never acts against the great, and is thus able to complete greatness. What is tranquil remains easily grasped. What has not yet betrayed signs is easy to plot against. The brittle is easily split. The minute is easily scattered. Act upon them before they attain being. Control them before they become chaotic. Trees that require both arms to embrace are born from insignificant saplings. A 9-story tower commences with a little accumulated earth. A journey of 1,000 kilometers begins beneath one's feet. From Aesop's Fables. The Wild Boar and the Fox. The wild boar was sharpening his tusks on a tree trunk one day. A fox asked him why he did this when there was neither huntsman nor danger threatening him. "I do so for a good reason," he replied. "For if I am suddenly surprised by danger, I wouldn't have the time to sharpen my tusks. But now I will find them ready to do their duty." The fable shows that it is no good waiting until danger comes to be ready. And lastly, from On War, by Karl von Clausewitz. This is as it should be. No major proposal required for war can be worked out in ignorance of political factors. And when people talk, as they often do, about harmful political influence on the management of war, they are not really saying what they mean. Their quarrel should be with the policy itself, not with its influence. If the policy is right, that is successful, any intentional effect it has on the conduct of war can only be to the good. If it has the opposite effect, the policy itself is wrong. Only if statesmen look to certain military moves and actions to produce effects that are foreign to their nature do political decisions influence operations for the worse. In the same way as a man who has not fully mastered a foreign language sometimes fails to express himself correctly, so statesmen often issue orders that defeat the purpose they are meant to serve. Time and again that has happened, which demonstrates that a certain grasp of military affairs is vital for those in charge of general policy. Before continuing, we must guard against a likely misinterpretation. We are far from believing that a minister of war immersed in his files, an erudite engineer, or even an experienced soldier would, simply on the basis of their particular experience, make the best director of policy. Always assuming that the prince himself is not in control. Far from it. What is needed in the post is distinguished intellect and strength of character. He can always get the necessary military information somehow or other. The military and political affairs of France were never in worse hands than when the brothers Belle-Isle and the Duc de Choiseul were responsible. Good soldiers though they all were. Chapter 13. Know Your Enemy. The Intelligence Strategy. The target of your strategies should be less the army you face than the mind of the man or woman who runs it. If you understand how that mind works, you have the key to deceiving and controlling it. Train yourself to read people, picking up the signals they unconsciously send about their innermost thoughts and intentions. A friendly front will let you watch them closely and mine them for information. Beware of projecting your own emotions and mental habits onto them. Try to think as they think. By finding your opponent's psychological weaknesses, you can work to unhinge their minds. The Mirrored Enemy. In June 1838, Lord Auckland, the British Governor-General of India, called a meeting of his top officials to discuss a proposed invasion of Afghanistan. Auckland and other British ministers had become increasingly concerned at Russia's growing influence in the area. The Russians had already made an ally of Persia. They were now trying to do the same with Afghanistan. And if they were successful, the British in India would find themselves potentially cut off by land to the west and vulnerable to more incursions by the Russians. Instead of trying to outdo the Russians and negotiate an alliance with the Afghan ruler Dost Muhammad, Auckland proposed what he thought was a surer solution: invade Afghanistan and install a new ruler, Shah Shuja, a former Afghan leader forced out of power 25 years earlier, who would then be indebted to the English. Among the men listening to Auckland that day was William McNaughton, the 45-year-old chief secretary of the Calcutta government. McNaughton thought the invasion a brilliant idea. A friendly Afghanistan would secure British interests in the area and even help to spread British influence. And the invasion could hardly fail. The British army would have no trouble sweeping away the primitive Afghan tribesmen. They would present themselves as liberators, freeing the Afghans from Russian tyranny and bringing to the country the support and civilizing influence of England. As soon as Shah Shuja was in power, the army would leave, so that British influence over the grateful Shah, although powerful, would be invisible to the Afghan public. When it came time for McNaughton to give his opinion on the proposed invasion, his support of it was so sound and enthusiastic that Lord Auckland not only decided to go ahead, he named McNaughton the Queen's envoy to Kabul, the Afghan capital, the top British representative in Afghanistan. Meeting little resistance along the way, in August 1839, the British army reached Kabul. Dost Muhammad fled to the mountains, and the Shah re-entered the city. To the local inhabitants, this was a strange sight. Shah Shuja, whom many could barely remember, looked old and submissive alongside McNaughton, who rode into Kabul wearing a bright-colored uniform, topped by a cocked hat fringed with ostrich feathers. Why had these people come? What were they doing here? With the Shah back in power, McNaughton had to reassess the situation. Reports came in informing him that Dost Muhammad was building an army in the mountains to the north. Meanwhile, to the south, it seemed that in invading the country, the British had insulted some local chieftains by plundering their lands for food. These chiefs were now stirring up trouble. It was also clear that the Shah was unpopular with his former subjects, so unpopular that McNaughton could not leave him and other British interests in the country unprotected. Reluctantly, MacNaughton ordered most of the British Army to remain in Afghanistan until the situation was stabilized. Time went by, and eventually, MacNaughton decided to allow